as Steve rightfully pointed out, I've been covering this a long time, and one of the most interesting subjects I've ever covered in marketing and media buying has been political campaigns and candidates. And I've always looked at it like they were just another category, but an extremely high consequence category. I covered, I think my first campaign was the Reagan re-election campaign for Adweek when it was owned by MediaPost founder Ken Fadner back in the early 80s. And I've always been interested ever since then. One of the other things I've observed over the years is that the political category is one that does a lot of disruption and innovation, particularly in media, particularly in data, and particularly in technology, and we saw a lot of that in the early part of the day here. So we're going to carry on that conversation. And as Steve pointed out, this one's a little different because it's purposely bifurcated. We're going to be talking about the intersection of Madison Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue, or the Midland states, or, and the idea here is to see what have we learned from the state of the art of political media and marketing that impacts the way major consumer brands work, and conversely, what is it that political brands are learning from the way mainstream media brands are working, including some new disruptive brands. So to do that, we have two experts representing these points of view. So to my immediate left is Jason Jersenovic, who is the global head of marketing innovation for Havas, which is one of the world's leading agency holding companies. It's unique in the sense that it's headquartered in France, but Jason works mainly.
Thanks to have us here today, Joe. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Be nice to meet. It's my first time here.
And then we have Zach Moffett, who's the CEO and one of the founders of Targeted Victory, a specialist in political media buying and advertising, and really an innovator in technology and data, which you spun off earlier this year, and you're focusing mainly on creating campaigns, targeting and executing them. So I just kind of like to lead off with a very general question, and then we'll dig into it, which is wear each of your hats and tell me what is the number one thing you would tell someone on the other side of the table, so you being a consumer marketer, that you think that the political media marketers in this room should understand? And then conversely, Zach, I'd like you to tell.
Want me to go first? Go for it. Well, following on from a discussion point earlier, we were talking about Facebook and the sort of the changes of the algorithms. And one of the things that us brand marketers have been really focused on is the power of the influencer. And I didn't hear that discussed too much this morning. And I think that's one of the things that's going to come out of these recent algorithm changes is, if brands or news content's being sort of automatically decreased in its popularity, and it's intended to be more about people talking to people, those people that have those followings, that have an understanding of who they are, going to become more and more important. And it's interesting to me to think about how that's going to play out in politics, because I don't know exactly how influencers work outside of sort of traditional broadcast media. That's a little different than sort of the powers that work with, on the internet.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, as we do more and more brand work and we work in the corporate space post November of 2016, we really see that the hardest part for big organizations is that they're almost so organized they can't disrupt themselves. And the speed of politics is our differential. And so for all of us who work in politics and are looking to kind of pivot over, really the differential that you bring is your ability to spin up quickly. The challenge that you face is you bump into a lot of organizations that have so much structure, they almost can't get out of their own way, whether that's in terms of managing its online ad spend, whether it's the way that they think about communicating to their customers and the disconnect a lot of them have. One of the challenges we always find is how similar some of the agencies think and behave. Obviously, there's outliers as it goes through, but there are structural biases built in by the very fact that many are in the same cities doing the same type of stuff. And so it self-perpetuates. And I think that we've just gone through an election that kind of showcases that it's very easy to have groupthink, and you sometimes need to be able to challenge. And I do think that's what politics, if handled right and well, is a value add that we can bring to the discussion that's a little bit different from kind of the status quo.
Yes, I should point out that Targeted Victory is not just a pure play political agency. It's working for corporate marketers, and you're learning differences. One of them is that political candidates are more fleet of feet, they're more responsive, but they don't have the infrastructure. And, okay. Havas does not do any political work. I think maybe one of your chief creatives did a campaign a while back in Europe, and since then you're completely 100%.
I mean, part of that is, a lot of our customers say they don't want to upset 50% of their audience. I mean, there are times in which it veers into politics, but CMOs, they want to do a good job. Their KPIs are about moving product or getting to the brand outcomes that matter to them, and it's less about sort of touting a political view or striking the hornet's nest from a point of view. That being said, it's interesting now in that this country is split in many ways, and there are some companies that are sort of embracing that as an opportunity for differentiation. We've sort of stepped away from that and really democratized the intelligence that we get from using data to get to these brand outcomes, sort of regardless of political affiliation in general. And I think that's what's interesting about today's time is we have access to these tools that really enable us to know who people are at a deep, deep level. And we can access their spend, where they spent, the empty shopping cart data, postcode data, first party, second party, third party, what they say, what they believe, and really know who they are. And that can be a big responsibility. And I think a big part of our focus is using those insights in a moral and ethical way, and making sure that the rules and conduct that are abiding sort of principles of privacy, which are becoming more important, and brands that embody those type of that level of transparency are the ones that are winning, and will continue to do so as consumers become more knowledgeable about how their data is being used for them and against them.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is I think a lot of people thought with Trump winning there would be this kind of 180-degree shift, and what we've really found is it's more like a 10 to 15% degree shift. In as much as what groups are learning, especially corporations are learning, is that it's better to have an internal dialogue and pretty much an all-out fight behind closed doors, so that when they put something out publicly, that there's some sort of like feedback loop that's pushed back. Because I think what happens is we all get so familiar with each other, it's very hard to create conflict in an environment where that can thrive and produce an end result that actually helps the brand move forward. And so that's a lot of what we've seen, is that kind of like you have to change your messaging, and you need more people at the table who are kind of incentivized to argue internally to come up with the best product. A lot of what we see when we've gone into brands, in many ways we may be the first Republicans in the door. They're surprised we don't have two heads, right? Like when you walk through, it's very weird for big brands to say like,
Republicans are people too?
Yeah, who knew? And so that was our biggest challenge that we looked at, and we're finding this now, whether it's like with Silicon Valley companies or you're finding it with like big CPG companies. This is a challenge that they realize that a lot of their customers are Republican, and just the worldview is different. And I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong one. It's just you have to have more points of view, and I think that's exactly what we try and create, that environment for that to be successful.
Zach, I'm curious to know your point of view regarding personalization. I mean, obviously, one of the downstream capabilities we have with this level of data is changing the message and even taking it down to a one-to-one type of thing. And a lot of brands are into that. Some are not. But I'm curious as to your point of view and how you're doing that sort of in the political arena.
Yeah, so that's the major driver of us from the performance marketing side. So really, Targeted Victory at its core on the political side is like a large-scale fundraising organization, right? Like lead generation, conversion, optimization, and any degree of personalization or one-to-one is going to increase that exponentially as you go through the process. That's probably the largest challenge we have. I actually had a conversation with a brand and asked them what their targeting criteria was going to be in 2018, and they said, no, that's for fiscal year 19. Like, we're not really, like, right now we're just doing regions. Like, we'll get to that next, and you just look at it and it's like,
wait a second.
Yeah, but you also understand on the flip side, they're looking 12 to 18 months out, so you understand, and when it's reach and frequency against a huge audience that they want to hit with a national brand, I get that, but we've always felt that the difference in politics to be really good at political marketing is that it's really a hyper-local play, right? Like the differential, and so the places that are similar to politics are tier 3 autos, home services, all these other quick serve organizations, and so you want to find things that are very localized, and so that's where the core understanding is, if it's not at a macro level, to be kind of another conservative point of view to bring another voice to the table. But we've found that has been the largest challenge, is that people have access to this, and also the bifurcation of the data within organizations, that like this group can't have this and you can't have all, and finding that's been a real challenge.
That's such a problem. I mean, people ask me all the time, what are the barriers of innovation that you see? And it's typically not like the CMO or the C-suite. It's typically sort of the infighting that you see inside these divisions, and maybe a lack of a single customer view. Obviously, some organizations are different than others, but I have a story I'll share with you. We're sitting there talking to a brand advertiser and going through this whole explanation of how segmentation and targeting works. And at the end of our presentation, which I thought was going really well, she's like, you should be talking to the CRM guys. And I was like, wait a second, you're not the CRM. It should be the same thing. And there should not necessarily be a difference of like, here's my audience versus this audience. It's really one audience. And that's something that sometimes requires a reset button on the client side to activate.
But I think that's really important for anyone in here who's a political marketer as well, though, because your value is that you're very wide, but you don't go as deep as some of these organizations. So a lot of times when I would go to conferences, I'd find that someone at the table knew so much about attribution, but then you'd ask about payment processing, and they were completely lost. That they'd lost the trail because that's not what they were responsible for. And so to me, the value is you bring the fluidity and the flat layer of politics, and then you have the humility to realize when you go into something else, there are people with greater expertise and depth, but you probably can bring a perspective like they don't even, a lot of people drop you on the landing page, another team then picks you up to optimize and convert you. Like that would never happen in politics, right? Like if anything, we're trying to bring everything together to have a single view, which is also limiting because then it's one company doing it, but at least we own end to end, and that's our responsibility from a conversion perspective.
So that might be a lesson that the brand marketers can bring to the table. We often hear this finger pointing exercise where the marketers will say, well, sales has it, and the sales say, well, those are stinky leads, and sort of that sort of crossing of the fingers occurs. Newer companies are different, though, especially companies that I think are born of the past. I'd say digital native companies where they see it as a single thing. And I think one of the point is they have a solid understanding of the platforms, and obviously the platforms of one. We were discussing right before this, the Facebook, Amazon, Google, et cetera, really own the spend right now, and so there's a relatively small, depending on who you talk to, 10 to 20% left of the spend for a lot of the other properties. So that's a big challenge. How do you see the fight for that last spend?
I mean, that's the largest challenge that we've seen this cycle is just like the increased kind of role that Facebook and Google play in it. And I think especially for Facebook as it relates to politics, because we've really got kind of caught up in this one-to-one matching. So you take the voter file, and if you think about it from a big number, it shrinks down from household to what you can match the voter file. Let's say Facebook's in the 75%. You have Google maybe in the 35 to 40%, and then other platforms maybe even less than that. And we've kind of overcorrected where everything now is an impression against an exact person that you know. And as a result, you're kind of leaving all these things on the table. And so it is a challenge, but the budgets are so tight in the spend just because people still aren't certain how to write and optimize linear, cable, digital buy, that they're kind of getting, we always call it budget by fiat. Like someone says, like, this is how much you have to spend. You're like, well, my audience grew. They're like, well, that's how much you have to spend. So either there's less frequency or there's less, and then you want to add all that on top of levels of personalization and how much you're going to spend on creative, and then the legal team gets involved, and what does that look like as you go through? And so those are the challenges that you face as you go through it. But I think that there's ways to work through it, and I do think that that's hopefully one of the big takeaways of the Trump campaign is also sometimes doing it differently is the way that it should have been done, and that's kind of the big learning away. And I think that's a huge takeaway that it comes through. The hardest part is how do you translate something that's a national election down to a congressional? What does it look like at the state level? And it's very hard, and I think that's my biggest fear is that we take these truisms out of an article that comes post-election day, and that becomes like the North Star for the next 4 years until the next person comes around and tells us like it was totally different, right? Everyone has magic beans. It's just a question of who sells them.
Yeah, so that's a great question I'd like to follow up on, which is if everyone's using Facebook to optimize their reach against the consumer, that's not very innovative. I mean, every brand marketer, every political marketer cited today does that. What's the next new thing? That's why I asked about Reddit or 4chan or other dark web.
I say we touched on mobile a bit in some of the earlier panels, and I think all of us would say that that is the next channel, but then at some point, SMS spam becomes irritable as well. And I think one of the reason emails is not as effective now is just there's just too much of it, and you can't stay on top of it as an individual. We've done a lot of work in sort of, I wouldn't call them sort of dark web, but I'd call them non-traditional communities. And when you're speaking to sort of an inner city community or a rural community, there's different points of view, and you need to think about ways in which you can make your message really resonate with those people. And so that's an important part of it. I think that's where we're spending. That's the last 20% is really targeting local communities, and some of that stuff, even though it's a digital world, is really around the community. It's local papers, it's at the local shops, it's getting people to become brand ambassadors, if you will, and that's a lesson that we learned from political marketing.
But Joe, one of the things that I think about a lot as it relates to this is I think everyone knows where it's going, and it's very interesting sometimes to jump 2 years ahead or 3 years ahead. Everyone's telling you this is a cycle where all your data is in one place and we know all these things about you, which tends not to be very true. But it's also amazing to me, like when you look at the studies, consumption is exceptionally high on mobile, but if you ask people's satisfaction of the consumption they're getting from mobile, it's very low. It's about 30%. Like they enjoy what's made. And so like, whether that's a YouTube ad that you have to click through and then it's horizontal or something else happening that doesn't work. Like we actually, as part of our rebuild after 16, was we started over our creative shop from scratch and only do 1 to 14 second, all vertical as it goes through. Only because that was our differential, because we said if we can figure out speed and do this, like this is the role we're gonna fill. And then we're not a threat to the political guys because they are kicking and screaming to give you a 15-second, let alone 30. So you have to reorientate yourself to go through. But how bad? There's so much friction, and the experience is so terrible. People don't optimize for mobile right now. So until they're doing that, all the other things that are coming are added plus, but the amount of political stuff I see online that's just no one should never have to watch it, let alone be paid to watch it.
What kind of creative do you do in 1 second?
Well, I mean, things that could be eye-catching, right? Like it's just a single movement that catches you to stop and look. I mean, that some sort of recalls that goes through. I mean, somehow we think static works. If static ads were great, we would just play music for 30 seconds and just have them, right? Like by definition, if banners were working the only way. So all we try to do is incorporate movement or some sort of juxtaposition or something that gives you something. But we're also seeing the decay rates. I mean, we see creative have a shelf life of about 4 days, maybe 5 in the space that we're in. So you also have to have a firm who's willing to build a model, a creative in-house model that's totally comfortable refreshing your creative. Like I work with a lot of firms within our holding company who get the perfect Instagram shot. They take 12 hours, it looks amazing, and I've got 30 iterations out the door, and I'm like, and tomorrow I got 30 more. And they just look at you like you're solving a different problem for them. They want to be the high end, but I believe that it's more likely that we'll iterate our way to where we need to be rather than always hit bullseye with every piece of creative the whole way through. And there's probably a balance between the two. I mean, the political guys tend to be overly scrappy, and I think that's what we're working through, but it's that mindset that I think is really core.
I'm aligned with you on the iteration. It's taking this sort of agile software point of view and bringing it to brand marketing. Sophisticated marketers now test and learn, they iterate, they make mistakes. They're able to leverage those mistakes into deeper insights and move fast. And I think that's one thing that increasingly we're seeing on mobile that you can see is it's an experimentation thing. Vertical aspect shooting, for example, was a big revolution for a lot of creatives. Like, what do you mean we're holding the phone the wrong way, right? That's a big deal. Also, sort of cutting through without volume. That's one of the problems. One of the classic mistakes that often happens is you'll have your traditional agency say, oh, here's a great creative message, and then just go put it on mobile, and they'll do a takedown of that creative, and that's not really the right way. You have to think about it first from the standpoint of I'm listening to this on my phone, on the train, or I'm in line, or I'm at my kid's soccer game, or whatever it is, and how can that experience really be something that I can resonate with, and then you could go back to a broadcast from that place.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of that last year, right? That it was a certain way. It was all volume off, remember, for Facebook, and then suddenly Snapchat breaks through, and suddenly it's all volume on, and it's lean in, lean back. And so you have to kind of understand because the consumer is taking us in these different directions, and I think that's what's hard if you have a one-year plan to not have the flexibility to iterate within there is a real challenge. And I mean, I think volume is a core, little add-on that suddenly opens up exponential different options that you can go through. And I think of that versus what a lot of our political ads, which are really just donuts, where it's 16 seconds of the same, and then we flip out a little bit. Like every ad could be, this was the problem in 2016. I think everyone trying to take on Trump. Every governor looked the same. They all cut taxes. They all did this, and it was very hard. They all blended together for someone who didn't really pay attention, and then someone punches through. And so the question is, how do you find that? And I think that's going to be the real challenge for the creative sides within the political world. Is how do you stand out now, especially with the changes that are coming on the platforms that also that they have to be successful on.
So one of the other things that makes Havas unique and interesting, and Jason in particular, is they have a very ethical approach. It sounds like an oxymoron to advertising. And it's one of the reasons we picked them as our agency of the year for this year, and we'll have a profile explaining it. But Havas is developing what I think is a unique approach to consumer marketing, and in effect getting consumers to help self-target themselves by providing their data, opting in. The reason I asked that question earlier today about GDPR affecting the U.S. is it's not just a U.S. law issue. This law in Europe is going to affect any market or brand, including a political one, that markets to or messages to a European consumer through a digital platform. So there's a lot of liability and exposure there. These cases are yet to be tested. Do you think that will have an impact on political media targeting, the data you use, and are you doing anything to prepare for that?
Here in the United States, I mean, I think that nothing moves that quickly here, so I think we'll be fortunate that we'll see when that change comes. I think people will be ready to pivot accordingly as they go through. I also am interested. It seems like whenever we try and change, we overcorrect. I mean, I would say that the Honest Ads bill that came through also was an overcorrection. Somehow we went from being underregulated to suddenly having more onerous legislation than what would come from television, and that's the challenge. I think a lot of people would be open to more regulation as they went through the process of it, but I don't know that where we are right now is probably the end point as it goes through, but we are constantly, and I think one of the things that people don't realize is that companies like ours that are the largest in our space, That's fine. The more challenging it is, the better it is for us because you have to be organized. I mean, I don't think people realize those aren't the ones that are the challenge. It's the long tail, both at the agency level and also the advertiser level, where a lot of the challenges are. And when those changes come, that's going to be the most dramatically impacted part of the market, not the people like us who kind of sit with a large ad ops team and all the other components, because that will just become part of our natural workflow as we work through all this stuff.
I mean, if you want for me to talk a little bit about Havas' point of view, we were one of the first sort of large holding companies to really embrace transparency. We led with, I think we were one of the first ones to pull out of Google from the standpoint of serving brand messages in a dangerous place, and I think that helped sort of YouTube realize they needed to take care of the consumers in that capacity. And that's an example, I think, where you're going to see privacy come to hit in the U.S. People may not know it's GDPR necessarily that's causing that, but they're not going to have these brand experiences that are tied to content that's not appropriate, if you will. Additionally, how you use data and how you are transparent to the end consumer in the use of that data is a critical part of having an ethical framework. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not doing a bad job. Actually, I think it means you're doing a better job because people can understand why they're being personally targeted, why the messages are being tailored to who they are, and frankly, enable them to self-correct. You flip the ad unit over and you could turn the slider and it becomes more effective in that capacity. And that's a big trend that we're seeing, especially if you look at how parents are monitoring their children's use of electronic devices. That same sort of thing is, I think, going to affect how we market.
Do we want to go to questions or just keep going? Okay, so I'd like you each to describe to the other side, what do you think is going to be the most disruptive force in the next year that could impact political in your case or consumer marketing in your case? What do you see that's out there that's going to change the game, so to speak?
It's always good to be put on the hot seat. I think there's a lot of things that are going to have impact. I am sort of stuck on this notion of how I can utilize privacy, and whereas it's still sort of open season right now in our climate to sort of buy and sell the commodities of individual data, down to my phone number, et cetera. I think that's going to be something that's going to drive people away from that medium, regardless of the fact that I could super micro target. Unless we can have messages that really resonate with what I want and what I'm aligned with. I'm not saying like a filter bubble of self-perpetuating, but something that I get and that I understand. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's lots of different ways to approach it, but I think the single thing that political looks at as it looks to corporate and how it can be helpful as it thinks through, it really is this idea that you either, it's disrupt or die to a degree. Like you have to be willing. That's not saying you change your whole business model, but the way that teams are set up even, like if I was thinking about a campaign now, I wouldn't even think about it like the structure of like a campaign manager with these teams and how it works. I mean, I'd be thinking much more like which team deals with things on a day-to-day basis, which one looks a week ahead, which one looks like the quarter ahead, and like thinking about that. And so we could take a lot of, like the things I like when I work with big brands is when we have our big bell meetings and everyone gets together every quarter. Like there's so much we learn from that. It is painful and tedious at times, but there's a level of sophistication to it that we just don't put into there now. But I also think that structure is probably what inhibits a lot of the marketing from really being truly great because it's so much compromise. And if someone doesn't like something, they can literally grind it down. Like it's almost like
water it down, right?
Yeah, it ends up like government where you just literally choose to filibuster until it doesn't, and they pocket veto everything. So that is what we bring. I think that's the mindset as it goes through. I think there will be offshoots. I definitely give a testament to what the Trump folks showed in 2016, but I think what they showed is probably what a lot of our marketers already believed. It's a validator. The same way in 2012 it showed what a lot of marketers believe as well. So you can always find your truth from there as it goes through. But what we bring, I think, is just a different approach.
I'll add one more that occurred to me when you were talking, and that's speed. And I think we're aligned on this point, and that the ability to measure what might be considered a fringe point of view or something that isn't necessarily mainstream, and then be able to amplify that and do that in a very fast time frame is something that sometimes brand marketers have a hard time with. We have a fast-moving division inside our company which can take a signal like that and turn it into a campaign in less than a day. So we'll shoot it, we'll edit it, we'll get it back, and instead of it being maybe very expensive ad, there'll be lots of versions of those, and then we can test and learn on those things that can iterate. That then you iterate and make those ones that are more effective increased value.
And I think that's the largest takeaway that was probably like the scare of 16 is this idea that we have 30,000 iterations of everything running at all times, and you actually divide the numbers out. No brand would make a determination on $3 of spend. So you have to be very, very careful, because I think there's also, it's very easy to find like things that validate. Now I think if you're in the performance marketing side, it's very obvious because there's an ROI and there's a one-to-one. I don't know that anyone's really at scale cracked the persuasion and the mobilization components of it. We know things that increase lift, we know these things, but we also have these studies that go out and we show 7% lift, and then we assume every agency that undertakes them would all get the same lift, right? Like somehow it's like just because it's been proven, then the execution would be universal. Right. That's one of the challenges that I think
you have no action you can correlate it to? You have no action you can correlate it to.
Well, you cannot, for us, there's only two things, right? It's either fundraising or turnout. Like the ability to change, I mean, we see through polling the movement as it goes through, but there's so many other factors. I mean, what we've been able to be a very good job of in politics is tying to a discrete action, i.e. voting or donating. And I think that's why those are the two things that politics' core function at. I think the other things have changed in people's minds. What we realize, especially in the presidential, there's so much earned media that's drowning out. I mean, it's the role of the news, all these other things that are just kind of like flooding the zone. Like that's why Donald Trump can be outspent by $400 million and probably still have $1 billion more of earned media as it goes through the process, just because there's different mechanisms. I mean, Donald Trump's Twitter feed is the tail that's wagging the dog that goes, it gets it out everywhere else. Like, yes, he has reach, but he doesn't have the reach that every other newscaster who picks it up and pushes it to the world gives it, right, as it goes through the process.
We have time for some questions. I wanted to ask about branding in an age of partisanship. What are you advising clients about the sensitivity when it comes to messaging? And we know that almost every brand message can be plugged into a red or a blue team, can be seen, its political implications can be seen in just about all messages.
You know, the truth on that is I really expected a lot more brand marketers to embrace that and to see that as an opportunity. And that it wasn't the case. You know, there was almost a conservatism, at least we saw with our larger advertisers, where they didn't want to sort of rock the boat. And that was counterintuitive to me. I expected that to really open up sort of new avenues and for many brands to sort of take a stand one way or the other and really embrace that. But it's been a bit soft, to be honest, in that regard, much softer than I expected.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's for the best. I think that very few are nuanced enough and sophisticated enough and willing to take the incoming, to take these very discreet. I think every time we see something blow up, it's because it's taken too one-sided of a point of view.
Across the line, right?
Yeah, and I think Silicon Valley is the most, it's probably the worst kind of potential area for this as it goes through, because there is such a universal approach to politics that makes it very hard for even an organization or a company to stand up, and for its own employees not to kind of want to tear it down first. I mean, I always say that Silicon Valley is either going to be disrupted by the government or its own employees. It's going to be like, it's not something else.
Or maybe
because
both,
it's going to get, as it goes through, because this is the challenge, is that they can't have a non kind of like mass consumption point of view, and that, as a result, you just almost shouldn't touch a lot of these things.
So I'd like to maybe close out with a question. You started out with this concept of paid influencer models, right, which corporate brands have figured out how to do that. I do think there are laws for disclosing even for political candidates, but do you see that happening where you're literally going to buy people to endorse candidates? And I should point out that about a year ago, your ex-partner, Michael Beach, at one of our events, did an analysis figuring out that the average cost per thousand of reaching the swing voters in the 2016 presidential election was like $700,000. So you could literally afford to buy every vote you need at that rate. But do you see that happening more?
So I'm actually a big proponent of the influencer marketing model as it goes through. I think it'll be a little different because I think there'll be disclosure. I think what will happen is you use the sophistication of identifying who these people are and highlight them, kind of a curation process to bring them to bear. I also think that they're very powerful at the hyper-local level, so a lot of people want them to be regional or national. They're actually much more powerful as influencers, and that's what we do. I mean, the beauty of digital in politics is you should just be like a force multiplier, and all we're doing is taking offline actions and giving it a little bit more insights and intelligence, and then making it a bigger opportunity as it goes through. So I do think that it's going to be where it goes. I think there's going to be a lot of painful lessons along the way that people are going to get it wrong, or do they have to put like pound ad and like these other things that go through the process. But I'm actually very bullish that that's definitely how brands and corporations should be thinking about it in the political space. I think for campaigns it's hard because they take for granted that's what their field teams already do, but they just don't have the sophistication at an individual level to what an organization can kind of bring to bear to solve these problems. But I do think you're going to see innovation in a non-presidential year either comes from someone who's in a neck-and-neck race and they have no option but to do it, or someone who's blowing someone out. And so I think you're going to see massive innovation out of Texas. I think the Abbott campaign is going to try a lot of. So someone who has like these big things, that's the best challenge for it. And then do those learnings get shared far and wide? That'll be the takeaway. But I think there's a huge opportunity this time, and I think it's really hard for agencies and campaigns to know how to price that, because agency model has kind of allowed for it to treat it like a cost per CPM and work it back, and kind of they know how to pay the influencer. The goal is really in the influencer model to get them before they have an agent, right? So that you get them before they're too expensive through the process.
We're seeing some examples of that where performance and influencer are coming together, where the influencer will maybe take a smaller cost or fee on the front end to have a share on the back.
How do you get a share of the back end of a candidate?
As I said, it'd be interesting to see how this
that's
unfolds.
that's called pay to play. Joe, Jason, Zach, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.